Okay, welcome everyone to, oops, like Elizabeth just said, we're all getting used to the Zoom, and we've definitely never taught Seed to Supper on Zoom before. So this is a learning experience for all of us, and I'm finding myself way more nervous than when I'm teaching in person. And my name is Judith Kenner, and I'm going to be your chat moderator, which means that when you have questions or comments that you want to make about the speaker who's teaching the particular unit at the time, that you can write them into your chat, and I'll keep track of them. And then when we get to the Q&A section, which is at the end of each teaching section, then I will let the instructor know what the questions were. So these are our ground rules. You already have been made aware of keeping your microphone muted, and also be aware that there's a time lag when you want to talk. So it's kind of like, well, I guess we're all used to time lags using Skype and things like that. Please hold your questions, like I said, and use the chat function for your questions as they come up while you're listening. And if you're calling in via phone and you don't have a chat function, write down your questions so that you can ask them during the Q&A period, or email them to us after the class. Other basic ground rules are to please be respectful when others are talking, and respect everybody's confidentiality. What gets said here remains here. Listen to understand what people are saying and try to stay engaged, which might be a little bit harder on an online format. Be willing to do things differently and to experience discomfort. Well, we're all, at least I know I'm already experiencing discomfort by doing this online. Rather than reacting to others, be a mirror to their statements and bring compassion to help others have realizations and breakthroughs. So that's the basic ground rules. And let's see if I can get the slide to advance. It went the wrong way. These are our facilitators for this evening. For technical support, we have Leah Gorman and Elizabeth Records. I'm Judith Kenner. And then our instructors are Jennifer Clommer, Malia Ashford, Shika Gush Gottfried, and Cheryl Stratton. This is just a summary of what we're going to be doing in all 4 sessions, but today is just session 1, of course. And so today we'll be talking about preparing to garden, which includes creating a planting plan, choosing a site, considering containers, making garden beds. And then in session 2, oops, come on. Session 2 is soil and plants, and we'll talk about soil, compost, fertilizer, seeds or transplants containers. And session 3 is caring for plants, and we'll talk about watering, weeding, pests, diseases, containers. And then session 4 is harvesting and storing. So we'll be talking about harvesting, nutrition and health, storing and preserving. And so one thing to mention is, if you have a question, let's say tonight you have a question about compost, just be aware that you'll be talking about that in the next session. And so we won't be covering those questions today. We'll only be covering questions about what we're talking about today, with one exception, and that is what we call the root cellar. And the root cellar is a place where we store questions that we are not in the curriculum. And so if you find that you have a question that's not in the curriculum at all, just put it in the chat, and I will put it aside for the root cellar. And we'll cover the root cellar at some time or other, even if it's only by email. Resources, these are to be mailed, including your participant guide. And so make sure that you fill out the survey, and Elizabeth put a link in the chat, but she'll probably do that again at the end of the session so that you don't have to scroll through all of them. And you can use that link to get to the survey, and then you'll receive your garden goodies in the mail. Here's just some pictures of the resources. And there we go. There'll be a Q&A after each section. Okay, now I give up control.
Okay, so I'm Jennifer. I'll be talking today about making a planting plan. So Elizabeth, do I have control? I'm not sure why I can't advance the slides. All right, oh, okay.
You are good.
Okay. All right, so in creating a planting plan, there's a couple really basic things you need to think about when you're starting out. First of all, it seems really obvious to say, grow what you and your family enjoy eating. It's really sad if you grow a bunch of radishes and they're beautiful, but no one wants to eat them. So I don't grow radishes in my garden because nobody really enjoys them. So you need to consider that you do have space limitations and you want to use your resources and that ground you have at a premium. You'll also want to grow what grows well in the Willamette Valley. So I don't know if any of you are outside of the Willamette Valley, but this course is really focused on Willamette Valley and the timing that's involved here in this area. So there's a lag in the space bar too. So when you get your resources, this chart is in the participant guide, and I think this is the most valuable page of all the book. This is page 14 in the book, and I'm going to focus on a couple areas, and we'll zoom in so you can actually get more closely. But you want to pay attention to the first column is the crops. So they're either warm season or cool season crops listed with a C or W. The planting window is in the second column. The footprint is in the third column. Then there's planting method, height, days to harvest, is some shade okay? And then if you can grow in succession or as a single planting. On the bottom, there's a key with the different planting methods and a key for the height that you'll want to focus on when you're making your plan. So here, this is a blown up version of that same chart. And if you'll take a look at the planting window, you can see that it's a range of dates. It's not a specific date. But you'll want to consider the planting window with your specific variety of seed that you got. Maybe you got a seed for a kale that can go out very early, and they'll say more specific dates for your region or area. But so you can look at this now and say, okay, it's April. What can we plant in April? So, for instance, broccoli. It says March through August. So you could plant broccoli. You could plant cabbage. You could plant carrots. You could plant cauliflower. I know somebody was saying they were looking forward to growing broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower. So now is an ideal time to get those started. You'll also need to take these recommendations with a little bit of grain of salt because the very first one with basil, the planting window of March, that really means you need to start basil indoors in March. If you were to put basil seeds outside now, they would probably not germinate. It's too cold at night. Even though we're getting very warm days now, it's the nighttime temperatures that are really the limiting factor in our area. So the other consideration is the footprint, and that means what size the plant is at mature size. So again, the basil, you might get it in a very cute little 2-inch pot if you were buying a transplant to transplant from a store, but you really want to allow 12 inches by 12 inches. And that's kind of a minimal size depending on your variety. Basils can get quite large. So here's a extreme example, probably the biggest vegetable we have with tomatoes. This is an excellent example of that cute little start that comes in your 4 or 5 inch pot. However, the mature size of your plant is 3 feet by 3 feet. So when you're planning for a tomato, you would want to make sure that you allow enough space so it can fully develop and give you those rich, ripe, awesome fruits at peak production from a beautiful big plant. Plant height is very important because you don't want to be blocking the sun. So you can see in this chart that short means under 12 inches, medium is 12 to 35 inches, and tall is 36 inches or taller. So you can see the corn in the background on this fence is going to be your tallest crop. Corn can get 6 to 8 feet tall. Tomatoes can get that tall too. If it's an indeterminate variety and it goes crazy. I mean, I've definitely had 6 feet tall tomatoes. And you can see this garden, I'm assuming that the fence is the north side because they have tall plants along there, and then the shorter plants like beans and the lettuces they have up in the front. So planting dates are also key for this area. The average last frost date for Corvallis is April 23rd. Last year, I remember looking up in our notes, I think our last frost at my house was like March 10th. So the average last frost date can be widely varying. The reason average last frost date is important is because some seeds, and you'll see that on the packet, they'll say something like, plant 4 weeks before your average last frost. So if you know that April 23rd is the average last frost, then you could plant pretty safely March 23rd. So you'll be looking at seed packets on specific varieties to know when to seed correct. This also gives you a guidance for when you want to set out those warm weather plants like tomatoes, basils, and cucumbers and melons and things like that that really like the warmth. You're probably going to aim closer to May so you avoid that average last frost. It would be very sad to put your those out and get a frost. There are some tomatoes that do it better under colder conditions. So as you think about the garden size, you need to really ask yourself, why are you gardening? Who will do the work? I saw a couple people in the chat who have a couple kids. You know, are you going to have the plot just for yourself, or are you going to have plots that the kids can do anything? I know when my kids were little, I had little areas where they could do anything, and you kind of have to just close your eyes. But really, you want to have those spaces accessible to whoever will be doing the work. How much time do you have? You want to make sure that you're able to maintain your garden well, and how much room do you have? The basic bottom line is really start small. Start smaller than you think. I know we all have great ambitions at the beginning of the season, but as the season progresses, the maintenance and harvesting and everything else can add up pretty quickly. We'll move into a question session on this planning side. So if you have questions, Judith will look through those.
Yeah, I haven't received any questions about garden planning at this point. Oh, here's one. Do strawberries grow okay indoors?
So strawberries are awesome crop. They weren't on that crop chart. So I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people do enjoy growing strawberries. Strawberries really are quite hardy here in this area, so you can grow strawberries outdoors all year round. They go a little bit dormant in the winter, and they're coming up now. The strawberries I have blossoms on them. So really, to get the best crops of strawberries, they should be outside because they really do like a lot of sunshine, and they'll grow best outdoors. All right. we'll move on to garden siting with Malia.
Hey, Elizabeth, do I have the controls? Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so I'll be talking about choosing your site, choosing the location where to put your garden. And I'm not able to advance the slides.
Malia, if there
There
you
we
go.
Just pretty slow. Okay, so your vegetables need four things. They need air, they need water, they need nutrients, and most of all, they need sunlight. So your job as the gardener is to make sure that those all those four elements are provided to your plants and optimized so that your plants are the best that they can be. Okay.
Malia, try clicking on the screen and then using your keys to advance it. If it doesn't work, I can do it for you.
Okay. Doesn't seem to want to move forward.
I will move it forward.
Thank you. Okay, so the biggest thing that a garden needs is sunlight. And the rule of thumb is that it really needs a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight. More is better, but 6 hours is the absolute minimum. The best site is wide open, and that's for the sunlight. Southern exposure is the best, and obviously shade-free. It's also really good to have your garden on a gradual slope, and that's so that the water will drain off and not puddle up against your plants. So that is an ideal situation. Next slide. So here is the ideal garden site. You've got great open site. You've got your great sunshine. You've got a nice slope down to the north. As Jennifer pointed out, you've got your taller plants on the north side, your shorter plants on the south side. And so this garden looks like it'll be really successful. One thing to think about when you're siting your garden is that over the course of the year, where the sun touches the garden changes. So keep that in mind. I had the very unfortunate situation of planting a winter garden in a nice sunny spot in July, and by October it was in the shade. So, so keep that in mind. Next slide. The other thing you need to do is get to know your soil. Here in Corvallis, we have some soil challenges. We will talk a lot more about soil in the next class, so stay tuned for that. But in general, the best soil is well-drained soil. You don't want to have any standing water. And in fact, if there's weeds growing there, it's probably a really good sign. Go ahead. So other things to think about in your garden, we talked about of the four things, one of them was air. So you do need to have good airflow. So siting your garden where you have nice natural breezes will help stave off diseases. We do see mold, powdery mildew, and blight, and having a nice airflow will combat those diseases. So that's a good consideration. And also make sure that your garden is somewhere where it's convenient. If it's out of sight, it's probably going to be out of mind. So in my case, I love to have the garden up front because I love to see my garden. So keep it up there where you can see it, and make sure that it's convenient. So in this picture, you see that their tool shed is really close. So you want it to be close to the tool shed, close to your water, and the other equipment that you might need. And make sure that it's somewhere that you will enjoy. Next slide. So there's some obvious things that you want to avoid. This is a terrible sight, unfortunately, for this poor gardener. You want to avoid low spots, wet spots, windy areas. We did say that you want to have a breeze, but if you have too much of a breeze and you end up having wind, which we do here in the Willamette Valley, that wind can do damage to your plants as well. The other thing to think about is what has historically been happening at that particular area that you want to put your garden. Is there a possibility that there might have been some pollutants, maybe lead paint, or an area that was used for disposal? So so think about that when you're placing the garden as well. Next slide. Okay, so what happens if you don't have an ideal spot, or you don't have a spot at all? Possibly your yard is just too small, or it's too shaded. You know that you'll be moving. So container gardening is a really good option, and it's in some ways very similar to in-ground gardening. In some ways it's different. So the similarities between container gardening and in-ground gardening are that there's a wide variety of plants that you can grow in containers and in an in-ground garden. They're also similar in that the growing season is going to be the same and the sunlight requirements are the same. The differences are that in a container, the plants will dry out much faster than they will in ground. Also, the fertilizer will be used up much more quickly, and your soil care will be more intense. You'll have to be revitalizing the soil more often with compost and other organics. So carry on. Next slide. So the 3 R's for a healthy container garden is the right preparation, and that goes with having the right sized pot, not only the right size diameter pot for your plant, but also the right depth. So diameter is important, depth is also important. And having the right soil. Some of the same considerations you'd want to have for container gardening to make sure that you've got your water nearby, your tools nearby. And also the right plant. So make sure that you've got the right plant. Some plants are very suitable for container gardening. Some plants just really aren't. And then the right care. As we said, they'll need more water, they'll need more fertilizer, they'll need more care with the soil. Next slide. So some considerations are that it can be more expensive because you are having to buy more soil and you are having to buy more fertilizer. So you want to make the most of what you plant in containers. When you're looking for containers, it's a time to be creative. If you look in this graphic, I think the ones in the foreground there are old recycling bins, and in the background are 5-gallon buckets. So just about anything that holds soil will work. Just make sure that if you do use a 5-gallon bucket or something, just make sure that it does have holes in the bottom. So you'll have to punch some holes in the bottom. So when you're choosing your plants to grow in your container, you want to focus on either quantity, so plants that you'll have a lot of them in the container, or quality, and that would be something that you get a big bang for your buck. So for the money you're putting into it, you get the most out of it. Next slide. So here is an example of some of the different plants that are appropriate for gardening in containers. And if you're looking for quantity, cherry tomatoes, pole beans, peas, arugula, lettuce, hot peppers are great. And if you're looking for quality, and that would be most bang for your buck, because organic greens, salad greens are expensive, and so are herbs. Those are 2 really good choices for containers. So next slide. In your book on page 15 and 16 is a really good reference of vegetables, not only the type of vegetables that are ideal for container gardening, but also the actual varieties. So while tomatoes are good for container gardening, not all tomatoes are good for container gardening. And so this graphic will tell you exactly what varieties to look for. Next slide. So this is just a blow up of that, and just helps you think about what you're going to put in your containers. So like one summer squash, a zucchini, would be one plant for a 5-gallon bucket. And a tomato, same thing, just one plant for a 5-gallon bucket. But if you're growing lettuce or other smaller things, you would be able to put more in that container. So next slide, that's it. So any questions about container gardening? I guess there's one other thing that I want to make sure that I say, and that is when you're choosing your containers and the location for your containers, a lot of times you want to put them on your deck. And think about the weight on that deck, because containers with the soil and the water can become really heavy. So just make sure that you put them in a place that is going to be able to support the weight of those containers. Any questions about containers?
Here's a question. How do we balance the earlier advice to pay attention to the matured plant size with having multiple plants per container? Using basil as an example, I see them in containers with several other herbs, but I think the previous presenter said the mature plant needs about a square foot per plant.
I think with container gardening, you can squeeze them in a little bit more, because you'll be watering it more and fertilizing it more. But the basic rules about the size still stand. I think that when you go to a garden store, they may be trying to put on a show and show you how beautiful their plants are and putting a lot of plants in there, but those plants may not really thrive if they don't have the proper amount of space.
Okay, here's another question. I am wondering if you can explain southern exposure a little further.
Oh, great, yeah. So so the angle of the sun here in Corvallis is, I don't know, I think it's about 23 degrees in the middle of the summer. So it's coming in at an angle. So if the sun is here, then facing the sun is your southern exposure. So you want to make sure that you're like, if you look at the shadows, that the garden is in a way that you minimize the amount of shadow on your garden.
Okay, and here's a little tip from Lisa. First Alternative Co-op has a diversity of containers from bulk product. They sell for $1 each.
Fantastic.
And then Elizabeth added, when Restore is open again, they're an excellent place to get the lowest cost containers.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move it on to Shika.
Okay. All right, so I'm clicking. Give me, okay. We'll wait for the thumbs up. While we're waiting, I'll just start talking a little bit to give you a preview of what we're going to discuss next is garden beds. And garden beds are things that, let's see, garden beds are basically anywhere you're going to put anything. And the reason you really want to think about where your garden beds are is so that you can focus your work on and not kind of just like I have a whole bunch of space that's random. So one of the easiest ways to specify a garden bed is simply to have a raised bed. And that's basically anything where you have some soil that's raised above the natural level of the ground that you have in your garden. And The reason you would want to create something like a raised bed is, like you can see in this picture, you've got specified areas, so it makes it easier than when you're walking, to avoid actually walking on the areas where you're growing something, which keeps you from compacting the soil, which is really important to help your plants grow better, to not have the soil compacted. Having a garden bed specifically also keeps you from wasting your resources on areas that are not going to grow. So specifically, you know, if you're putting water on everything, then you are going to have things growing where you don't want. You might have a lot more weeds if you're watering your beds and, you know, your pathways, non-bed areas, depending on what's there. And then one of the best reasons for having a raised bed this time of year is that the soil warms up faster and you can start getting things planted earlier because of that. It also helps with the drainage. So especially, you know, you've got beds where when it's raised, the water can drain down the slopes easier. So when you're thinking about garden beds, you want to consider when you're planning kind of how big do you want your beds to be. Now, normally the width of the beds are about 3 to 4 feet wide. And the reason for that is you have to think about how easy it is going to be for you to do work in that bed. So that's usually someone can reach from one side to the other on a 3-foot bed, and you might want to make it even narrower if you have a shorter reach. A 4-foot wide bed is nice if you can generally go around both sides and reach into the middle from either way. Now, looking at this picture too, you can see that the beds are long. Now the length just completely depends on how you want your garden set up and things you can think about. The longer the bed, the more you have to walk around it, but it's also the more space you can utilize in your garden. Now, the other piece when you're thinking about a garden bed that you want to consider is not just where you're going to grow things, but how you're going to walk around the bed. And so here you can see there's some paths between the beds. And the recommendation is generally, if you're just going to walk, if you need a footpath, you should plan about 18 inches between your beds. But if you need to have a cart go between the beds, it should be about 24 to 36 inches. Now, when you think of garden beds, many of you may think of raised beds having, you know, wood retaining walls or, you know, something very rigid. Now you can, but there's absolutely no reason a raised bed doesn't have to have specific walls. There are good reasons for it, and you should think about that. But when you're getting started, simply, you know, just raising it and putting soil in will be just fine. But if you have mobility issues, that's a good reason for creating some rigid beds on the sides. And also, when you do have a rigid edges, then you can raise your soil up higher and you can also make your paths a little narrower. But it does cost more money and it's a little more effort to start with a whole bunch of wood beds. So one thing that I did in my garden, even though I have space, I wasn't sure when I had my garden what I wanted, where I wanted the beds. And so actually I had a couple of wood-sided raised beds, and then my other ones, and I'll show you some pictures later, I had just raised, mounted in the ground bed so that I could shift them around if I wanted. And I actually did that 5 years, after doing my beds for 5 years, and then I switched it around to try something different. So today we're going to go through a couple of different types of beds, and you'll see here, I'm going to just go through the instructions for each of the kinds that are kind of the simplest. Crossed out double digging, it's in your book, so you can read about it when you get your book, but it's a lot of effort, and you know, why make that effort if you don't really have to? So we'll show you the easier ones first, and you can read up if you're feeling very ambitious and aspirational for the other ones. So making the raised bed the easiest one is a very basic raised bed. And all you have to do is loosen the soil that you already have. And you want to, basically you want to lay out where you're going to put a bed. And so I recommend, you might use some twine and some sticks just to lay out where the bed is so you know where you're working. And you can kind of see it here in the picture there. There's some string laid out. And loosening the soil basically means just taking like a garden fork. You don't have to do a whole bunch of huge digging. You can take a garden fork and gently kind of lift the soil or just kind of wiggle it in so that it creates some drainage. Then you're going to spread some compost. Doesn't have to be very much. You can see here it really just talks about 2 to 3 inches of putting compost in. Then, all of these are in layers. You're going to put a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer in, and then you're going to take all of that and turn it around so that you have, basically you want to have 6 inches of workable light soil that makes it easy for the plants to come up. You want to rake those beds level, looking at to make the seed bed as easy as possible. And then you want to put something around the path so you can delineate your bed. Now, this method of raised bed is super easy. It also kind of presupposes that you have a pretty good, kind of your garden layout already has the right components, because as you can see here, you're not having to do a lot of work, but your bed isn't very deep. And so the thing you want to think about here is if you don't have kind of a good foundation already and you're putting this stuff on top of it, a raised bed like this works, but you're going to think about the types of plants you want to put in it. It may not be as good for your tomatoes that need a deeper, really good foundational soil, but it might be just fine for things that are shallower like lettuces. Now, the next method is called sheet mulched garden beds, and some of you may have heard this term. It's also very similar to lasagna gardening or lasagna composting. And there is so much information online. You could spend hours and hours looking up things, and there's all kinds of pictures on how to do this and how to layer, all great details. But the primary reason you might want to do a sheet mulched garden bed is it's kind of creating a longer term foundation for your garden bed. Now that said, it usually takes more time because you're going to basically have layers, and they're going to need to break down. And so sheet mulch garden beds generally are things you might start in the fall, although you don't have to. There's lasagna bed gardening that's similar to sheet mulches, but you can actually start gardening in it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in here. So you can see here kind of, well, what does that mean, having a sheet mulched layer? Well, you've got different sets of layers, and if you start from the bottom of that picture, you can see, oh, there's the soil, and then after the soil, on top of that, kind of what do you do? And essentially with sheet mulching, you're going to clear out whatever vegetation you have, and where it says slash vegetation, like for example, sheet mulching is great if you've got a lawn and you're going to turn it into beds. That's actually what I did when I first moved here into my house. I had a front yard that was all lawn, and I didn't want to deal with all of it at once. And so I just started getting rid of grass in shapes of beds, and would just kill the grass by layering things and then create a bed from that. And so that's a great way to start converting lawn spaces or weedy spaces. But you can't necessarily just stick things right over it. Depending on how weedy it is, you might want to clear that out. And so that's the slashed vegetation. And once you do that, you want to put in, here it talks about putting in some amendments and thin layers of manure. But the main thing I think for sheet mulch for me is getting a thick layer of brown materials, brown matter. And what this is like newspaper or cardboard, that's really going to tamp down the weeds and create a base that makes it easier to garden on top of it. And so once you have that newspaper or cardboard, then you put, again, a little thin layer of manure, and then you're going to have, again, some brown matter, but this is different. This is brown matter that's going to break down more than newspaper or cardboard. So 8 to 12 inches, it says here, like of hay, bedding, straw, those sorts of bulk organic matter. Then again, a little bit of compost. And the compost here can also it can be any green matter. And so you can use garden scraps, kitchen scraps. The thing you have to remember though is you're not going to want to leave that on the top layer. And so the way you kind of make this sheet mulching is you keep repeating layers of brown and green matters alternating together until you get, you know, somewhere between 8 to 16 inches of that. And in your book, it'll also talk about that in more detail. And I think in one of the next sessions when they talk about soil, they'll go into more detail about what exactly comprises brown matter versus green matter. But those are the two things that kind of help organically. They'll work together to break down over time and create a bed that's rich in nutrients all around. I think there's a delay in switching slides. Okay, there we go. The last method is making a raised bed is called the no-dig method. This is the simplest method of all. You can look in the picture. Basically, you're laying down a layer of cardboard and then you are putting soil on top of it. Now, in this directions, you know, it talks about you can see here that there's a lawn. You don't want to just start doing it right on top of the lawn. You want to get, you know, some of the vegetation out of the way, but then you use that cardboard. Again, similar to sheet mulching, that cardboard is going to be a thick layer that keeps whatever vegetation underneath. It's going to help it to die because it's going to keep the sun and nutrients from getting to it. And it's also going to create a good foundation. And then you're basically just adding potting soil on top of it and you're ready to go. Now, the negative of this method is it takes a lot of potting soil. And if you bought bags of potting soil, that's pretty expensive. So that's why it's not generally the kind of the most cost-effective method. But if you need to get started right away, or if you've got pretty small beds, this is a great way to do a couple of them and kind of get going. And then you could create some sheet mulch beds for longer term things or to plant things later. So like I said, I wanted to show you an example of what my garden looks like. And if it comes, I will show you. But it's a combination of these different types of beds. There we go. So on the left are the kind of just very informal raised beds. I don't have any rigid sides to them. They actually used to be oriented 90 degrees the other way 5 years ago. So I'm playing with my different types of exposure by being able to change my beds around. They're also fairly long. They're 15 to 17 feet. And I play with that sometimes too, or I can divide them. And then on the right, I've got one that has wood sides that I've had for years and years. And I like that one because I can put structures over it pretty easily and I can attach my PVC. And I've got this in my garden right now. And so I started gardening, putting things in end of February because I could keep everything covered. So those are the reasons to have kind of some of everything. Why pick one? Now, you have any questions, I am happy to answer them about making garden beds. And I will mention again that there are really good pictures, images in the book when you get it on exactly how you can, all of these steps are in there. Okay. Any questions, Judith?
Not getting any questions. Oh, wait, there's one. What direction are your beds now? Is that better?
Okay. My beds are north-south now. Is that right? Yes. Well, yes, my beds are, well, the beds are east-west. The length of the beds run east-west so that I can get the exposure, southern exposure going. As the sun comes, it goes kind of across all the beds. And I did that because my bed on the, I guess, as you're looking at my garden, the bed on the northern side, then I can have taller plants in the specific areas that way and can manipulate how much sun I get the most because I don't actually, well, another reason I changed it is because I used to have fir trees that shaded the yard, and the neighbor took them out. And so that was really cool. And it really changed the exposure in my garden. And so it was great. I was like, oh, I can just shift my beds around. It was awesome.
And okay, great. Here's a question from Kathy. What's the best way to clear out weeds and grass before you start?
Well, other than a lot of physical labor, honestly, if you have time, I think the best way is to do the sheet mulching. That's how I planned things. I would actually, in the fall, I would think about where my bed's going to be in the spring, and I picked up all kinds of cardboard. I started hoarding cardboard and newspapers. I actually still have newspapers, and I haven't gotten the paper in several years, but I still have newspapers because I knew I wanted to keep all of it. And so I used a whole bunch of cardboard and newspapers in the fall to tamp everything down. And then by spring, then I could start doing the other layers of sheet mulches. And I thought that was the easiest. I tried double digging, and it is a lot of hard work, especially when you have clay soil. So timing is everything.
Okay, let me add to that a little bit, because I cleared out some grassy areas in my yard by putting cardboard down first and then black plastic on top of the cardboard. And this was like in the beginning of February, and by April, the grass was all gone and I could just take everything off. Okay, and here's another question from Neil. Any thoughts about going down on existing old wood chipped mulch?
Old wood chip mulch is actually pretty good. If it's broken down, I mean, like you saw in my beds, I have wood chips for my pathways. And, when I switched my beds, I had already had wood chips around the area. And I found when I moved them that all of that stuff broke down really well. The only reason you wouldn't want to do it when the chips are too big, because as wood chips break down, they're going to suck up nitrogen. And that's not going to be so great for the plants, because you want your plants to have that instead. But if it's well rotted, it should make a fine base, but just be aware of that. Okay.
Yep, that's it for the questions.
Okay. Thanks.
Elizabeth, can you put up the Kids Grow? Or
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
good.
Me too.
Can't find my my own logo to know if I'm muted or not. Sorry.
Jennifer, I believe that you're next, and then we'll have Cheryl talk about Kids Grow. Is that all right with you too?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. I got a little discombobulated. So now this is where you pay attention, because you actually will have a little bit of homework applying what you've learned tonight and coming up with a site and making a planting map. So this is an example of a bed that I'm redoing. It had been in a cutting garden for bouquets and perennial flowers and some herbs mixed in and some pollinators. And so it was kind of a flourishing mess. So I've converted that, and we're going back to vegetables at home. So I'm calling this Jennifer's Salad Garden Plan. So one of the things you'll want to do when you're deciding what you want to grow is sit down and write out what your priorities are. So for me, the top priorities are really to have awesome, amazing, fresh salad greens. Somebody said they were looking forward to growing kale. I don't know that many people who love kale, but I love kale. So I hope to have these greens going all through the summer. Another thing I really like to have on hand so I can use it easily in salads is a smaller slicer tomato that will produce all summer. Have a cucumber, and I really like making my own salad dressings and having herbs on hand, so I can herb up things I'm making. So I don't have to go to the store and buy a bunch of oregano for $2.99 and I only use a few sprigs out of it. This way I can have an easily grown plant like oregano, and I can make divisions off of it and put it other places. And so I have a lot of perennial herbs as well as annual herbs. So the first step is to go out and measure and sketch your planting area. Don't worry about making it to scale. Just take out your measuring tape and make a really rough plan and get in the main directions on there so you know where north is and where things like fences that are going to throw shadows and gates. And if you have large plants that are going to throw shadows or the roots can affect your raised bed, put that in your plan and keep that in mind when you're planning where you're going to plant things. So you can see in this bed, I had some perennial herbs in there already. You can see on the west edge, there's a big clematis that goes up against that fence. And there's a gate that opens and closes there too. So you'll want to make sure you don't have things that are going to be tender or get easily squished or mashed, depending on where your hose bib is. So you have, when you're dragging around your watering thing, you want to make sure that you have good clearance too. So then you take your plan, your sketch, and bring it inside and actually put it down on graph paper so that you can use your crop chart to get those footprints of your plants to scale. So this I was using 1/4-inch grid, so a 2x2 block is 1 foot. And you can see that my bed is not an exactly rectangle. It's kind of it's wider and rounded at the end. So I tried to include that on my drawing. So the next step is take your list and kind of prioritize what you really want to have in your bed. I prioritized by size because those are the things that are going to be restrictive because I can't, there's not a lot of choices once you get the tall things in place. So I put the tomato in the back north edge. I'm going to keep in mind how deep this bed is. So 6 feet across is pretty deep for me to be able to reach in. So I'm going to trellis the cucumber up 3 or 4 feet, but I want it reachable from the north side. So I can reach in and harvest the cucumbers. But cucumbers are pretty big and they're easy to harvest. So to have that in the middle of the bed is pretty easy. Now, remember that tomato, I put that on the north edge because I need to be able to reach into that tomato to harvest. If that tomato were in the middle of the 6-foot bed, it would be a lot more difficult for me to access that. The sweet pepper gets the primo place right in the middle on the south edge of the bed because this pepper wants the hottest, warmest place. This edge has some blocks on it, those concrete blocks, so it will get nice and warm. This bed is, as you'll see, oriented east-west. That's why I was asking Chica which way her beds were oriented, because I've had experience in a bigger garden that the north-south beds created a lot of shade on the far north plants. And for in that garden, we put a whole row of tomatoes in there, and they didn't do as well as the beds that were facing east-west because they can get the full sun, like Malia was talking about, where that angle of the south sun made a lot of difference the direction that the beds were oriented. So after I map out where the bigger, taller things are and the warmer things that I'm going to plant later, I'm considering where the perennial herbs are. And the perennial herbs are cool season crops, and they require less fertilizer and less water. So I wanted to keep, the perennial herbs all in one area, so that at the end of the season, when I'm pulling out the things that are done, like tomatoes and the cucumbers and everything else, I'm not tangling up the herbs and things. I'm keeping my perennials all in one area, and the warmer seasonal crops on one area. You can see also I have space here. These are all annuals. Those are my salad greens, the lettuce, the spinach, the kale, the chard. And you can see I still have spaces. I'm going to not plant, I won't plant the tomatoes and cucumbers and sweet pepper until May when it's warmer. You can see I have a little patch of cilantro seeded there. But all of this blank area is where I'm going to be doing succession planting. We didn't talk about that as a planting strategy. But, you know, there's just 2 of us in our household now, so I don't need 30 lettuces all coming mature at the same time. So I'll probably plant some bok choy and some more lettuces, so they're staggered, and do them like every 2 weeks, bit by bit. So that was the plan, and this is what I actually planted last weekend. It's sometimes a little bit frustrating when you get outside and what you planned doesn't go exactly as you planned. My husband really is the tomato guy, and he thought, which truly was pretty true, he thought that having that tomato next to the fences would it would get shaded in the late afternoon, so it would be better to have the tomato in another bed somewhere else. So we did that and swapped out where the compost bin was and put the compost bin into the shade. But everything is under cover now, and hopefully they'll start growing. I'm excited for this salad garden. Any questions? Oh, I didn't put a question page, sorry. Any questions on making your planting plan?
So Jennifer, this is Judith. You might want to talk about what you want the participants to bring with them or to have ready to talk about in the future class.
Right. Yes, so I think we have Sue and Lynn on this call. So Sue and Lynn will be leading the next class, and I think they might have a plan for some time up front for that. I'm not sure, but that is your homework to have, mostly for you to be able to have that in mind when you're selecting seeds and other things. I think we could do that. I'm just talking off the top of my head. It would be kind of fun to have people bring their planting plans and do that in the time you have before the class actually starts. So still sign on early, and if you have a planting plan that you can share, how would it be best to share that? I need somebody with more technology.
That's
Leah, would you have a recommendation about how people would share their map?
This is Elizabeth, and I'm not quite sure what the best way is. I'll have to look into if there's a good way for students to share it in the chat or share it another way. So you'll be getting a follow-up message after this class with some of the resources we've talked about, and it will include a way to share a planting plan if you would like to do that.
Okay, here's a comment from Leah in chat that says we can send out a plan by email.
Good.
Okay, and then I have a couple questions for you, Jennifer, from Danielle. Is there any resource for planning for indoor gardens?
So Danielle, are you talking about indoor vegetable gardens or indoor herbs, or just growing plants indoors in general? Indoor containers. So indoor growing, the biggest challenge Going back to Malia's comments about site and what we need to provide for our plants, the biggest indoor challenge is to provide enough light. That is the biggest challenge because, you know, housing temperature, inside temperatures are warm and adequate for vegetables. But if you see plants that are kind of leaning towards the light and leaning towards the window, that means they're not getting adequate light. You can use shop lights, the fluorescent lights. I know that Habitat for Humanity often has those fixtures available. I don't think they're open right now, however. And you can also get fluorescent bulbs that are different wavelengths. So it's nice to be able to do a warm wavelength and a cool wavelength to get the broader spectrum covered for light.
So Danielle added yes for herbs, etc. So I'm wondering, Danielle, did you mean perhaps like putting herbs on your windowsill? Yes, like that, she says.
Yeah. So if you have south-facing windows, those are going to be the best, again, because of the angle of the sun coming in. I have one south-facing window in my house, and unfortunately, my bed is in front of it. So that's why my house is terrible for growing plants indoors. I have mostly east-facing windows, and all the plants, the herbs and starts that I've done, I have to provide additional light. And fluorescent lights have worked for me. It's not the prettiest thing having it right there in the nook, but you can be pretty creative and hopefully have some way to make an adjustable kind of light. So as the plants grow, you can adjust it and keep it low towards the plants.
Okay, so Sue also added a comment, microgreens grow well indoors. And Danielle says, okay, thank you. And we have one more question from Lisa, which is, can you talk about other trellising vegetables?
Oh, are we going to be covering trellising at all? So that is a unit in the in this session talking about trellises and growing vertical. Other trellising, just off the top of my head, cucumbers, melons, pole beans, scarlet runner beans are all great trellised. I usually grow a bush kind of squash, so I have not tried doing squashes on a trellis, but I have seen that in the Benton County Master Gardening Association at the demo garden. It got very creative. One year, Sally did a bed of squashes trellis, quite tall. They were like 6 feet tall trellises, and she used bras to, like women's bras, to trellis up the squashes or melons or something that she was using. She was tying them up in bras. So that was a pretty creative way to do that. Anybody else? We have a lot of experienced garden here. Anybody else grow up squashes or any?
Well, Leah made a comment that she likes to grow squash up a trellis.
I grew small watermelons
Uh-huh.
on a trellis.
That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, the mini loves probably would do okay on a trellis. The bigger ones, you know, like sangria and the 25 pounders would be hard on a trellis. Yeah, the smaller ones you can.
Very small. Yeah, they don't hold up too well. It was a rope trellis. I did end up having to support several of them. You know, we're talking like 6 to 8 inch watermelons.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it's like bigger than a grapefruit, to probably not try to trellis it. But if it is a grapefruit size or smaller, then give it a try. One time I tried to grow a 3-sister garden with corn, beans, and squash, and I did have some squash go up the corn, but they retained their proper size. And I think it was just kind of the stress of trying to not drop their fruits at that height. But yeah, a squash that was supposed to be that big ended up that big. So.
And here's another note from Lynn. I've grown tromboncino, squash, cucumbers, and melons on trellises. What kinds of trellises would work?
So I'm most familiar with growing on, I can't remember what, hog panels. So you can get their heavier duty, and the panels, I think they're like 16 feet long or something. But you can get them at Home Depot and they'll actually cut them to size for you. So if you want a 16-foot thing cut into 3-foot chunks, you can do that. And I just have tied them up on metal T-posts, and I'll just structure them that way. I've also used bamboo because I have bamboo in my yard, using, it's like rope or twine zigzagged around. It's kind of a lot of work to do, but they're quite beautiful. If you have free sources of wood materials, that's I think the best way to go. Any other ideas?
I think we're good to move on. Oh, here's a good idea from Elizabeth. A low-cost option is to pound in a couple of T-posts and thread wire or twine between. Can be reused for many years.
All right, now we'll move on to some Kids Grow resources with Cheryl.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Cheryl, and we are emailing as well as snail mailing you a document that has a lot of suggestions for gardening activities you can do with your children. I noticed that some of you answered the question about, are you gardening with kids? That was on the chat, and I think I saw a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and then I saw that favorite gardening age, teenagers. So there are different challenges with each group. So in our document, we have various activities, and hopefully you can find 1 or 2 or 3 that will work for your age child. The document has suggestions for each of the 4 seed to supper sessions, but feel free to try any one of them at any time. Some may work better for you than others. Choose ones which are age appropriate and fun for your child. Fun is really important because maybe your child doesn't associate fun with vegetables, but there are ways to make it fun. When you're planning your garden, you might want to give your child their own space. I think Jennifer had talked about that. Whether they have a dedicated space or not, ask them what they'd like to grow. Maybe it'll be their favorite veggie, or maybe it'll be French fries. Maybe it'll be something they've only heard of. The idea is to listen to their input so that they feel ownership of their part of the garden. They'll learn what works, what doesn't work, and what changes to make next time. Gardening is not only fun and educational, it teaches patience and perseverance, because these things don't appear overnight. Some things do. A younger child can get a lot of satisfaction out of growing radishes. I remember my children pulling them up before they were fully grown, but hey, they wanted to know what was going on beneath the soil. The other thing is that you can introduce your child to new foods. I really encourage you, there's in the first, I think up here on the slide, you see eating the alphabet. This is a really fun one. You could make a list, you could make a poster, you could have your children draw. You're naming fruits and vegetables that begin with letters of the alphabet from A to Z. So when you're going by that strawberry field out on Highway 34, you might pull over, see strawberries, and there's your S. Or you might plant zucchini. There's your Z, and you'll have a lot of it. Let's see. Just a tip, some of those fruits and vegetables, or some of those letters, are a lot harder than others to come up with a fruit or vegetable. My favorite vegetable for the letter R is rutabaga. My favorite O is okra. And I'm sure you'll come up with some other vegetables. Finally, one website I'd really like to emphasize, and you can't see, oh, it's there under number 3, is foodhero.org. Click on gardening at the top of the homepage and then click on kids on the left side of the page. You'll find some great suggestions on that site of crafts to make, of recipes that kids can help with. All of the web addresses and suggestions will be in this document that you see on your screen, and you'll get a hard copy, and you will also have it emailed to you. I hope you enjoy gardening with your children. And we're out.
Does anybody have any final questions before we end our session today? One thing I wanted to ask Elizabeth, I had a request for somebody to get a link to the recording of this session so that they can review it, or if they were having technical difficulties. So is that possible?
Yes, we can provide a link to that, and we will share that link in an email that will come out with all the other resources and goodies we've talked about today. We'll have an email between this week and the classes next week, and all this stuff and some more goodies as well will be included in there.
And then also, Elizabeth, could you put the link for the survey that you want everyone to take in order to get the garden goodies one more time in the chat, so it'll be at the bottom? So everyone, I hope you will all come back on Thursday at the same time for our next session, which is soil and plants. And you'll learn more about building healthy soil, compost and fertilizer, and the difference between planting seeds or transplants. Oh, I have a question about Master Gardener plant sale. We don't think so. It's still up in the air in terms of whether we'll be able to have one before it gets too late and too hot to have a plant sale. But at this point, I don't think there is no date planned. Is that correct, Elizabeth?
The plant sale is postponed, new date to be determined. So the hope is that we'll have one sometime in 2020, but not in the month of May, the big plant sale at the fairgrounds like usually happens at this point. My understanding is that that is simply not possible with the public health situation, but the group that organizes that is actively working to reschedule it for a later date. And if you keep an eye on our website, that information will be shared just as soon as it's available.
I think that even if the plant sale does go forward at a later date, there will be very few vegetables. We weren't able to go ahead with the mass of tomatoes and peppers. So most of what will be there will be the perennial garden, like flower garden type plants. Is that right, Jennifer?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we will not have any tomatoes, basil, peppers, any of the annual vegetables will not be available through the Benton County Master Gardener Association this year. That's an unfortunate situation. We hope to have, if we're allowed to, we're hope to have our summer workshop. In the past, we have had in May a tomato giveaway, but all those plans are very much on hold right now. So the tomato giveaway was originally scheduled for the 3rd Thursday in May, but we're not sure that that will happen. And that tomato giveaway was specifically for Seed to Supper participants. So all of you are participating in this. If we do have a tomato giveaway, it is tomato giveaway. They're not for sale. You come and get tomatoes. So hopefully we'll be able to do that the 3rd Thursday in May.
Currently, we're still working under Stay Home, Save Lives. As you know, we're a volunteer program of OSU, and they are following the governor's orders. So yes, what we can do very much depends on what's happening in the rest of the state of Oregon. But we also recognize that in this crisis, people need to grow food, which is why we're all here today. And we will do our utmost to provide as many resources as possible for every student in this class.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank
and
you.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing you on Thursday, or hearing from you anyway.